Welcome to Global Skills Day. And we are about to have a great group discussion on skills for entrepreneurship. So I want to introduce everybody that is not a panel. This is not a panel. This is a group discussion. And what that means is that we're all going to just talk, share insights, talk about the realities of being entrepreneurs, and also introduce our own companies. And I'm the moderator. My name's Andrea Cates. I'm with FutureProofing Next, based in San Francisco. My role today is to moderate this not a panel and keep the discussion lively. So I'm super excited about the people that we have here. For people who don't know me, I am, first of all, very excited about Gary Bolus and Arnobio Morelix, who are sponsors of this whole track. It's been really an incredible day in terms of new insights and innovation for entrepreneurship and global skills and what's happening in the world of work. Second of all, if people want to know who I am, my specialty is to move companies to revenue from an initial innovation. And so I work with a lot of large companies, but also, since I'm in Silicon Valley, a lot of combinations of startups and large companies. So super excited to be here. So this is the group discussion. I'd like to introduce people with a little bit different piece of a little different approach. I'd like to start with Ronit Avni. And we had a little conversation beforehand. And what I think is super exciting about Ronit is, first of all, she is herself an entrepreneur and a Peabody Award-winning media producer. She was named a young global leader in the World Economic Forum, and she is founder of and CEO of Localized. And I'll also tell you about Localized, because I would love for her to kick off not with having to describe her company, but with the answer to a provocative question. So Localized is a career tech platform that connects entrepreneurs with emerging talent from top universities and talent hubs globally. And so, Ronit, welcome, welcome. And I'm really interested in the urgent need that you had to start Localized. What was it that was the screaming need that made you think, you know what, we need to start a company to solve this?
Thank you so much, Andrea, and thank you for having me. It's great to be here with the other panelists. There is so much talent around the world that is largely undiscoverable. So if you think about the number of students who are enrolling in post-high school education, post-secondary education, we're talking about over 150 million students. The majority of them are in emerging markets, 2/3, that's about 100 million. And that's going to grow to about 1 billion by the year 2050. And again, most of those, that talent is in growth markets, places like the Middle East, North Africa, South Asia, LATAM, and they are 85% of the world's population. They are the majority of the future workforce of the world, and the majority of them are under the age of 28. And so when we're talking about the workers of the world, or the future workers of the world, we're largely talking about these populations. And yet there's a disconnect between the training that's being received, and this is true pretty much everywhere, and the needs of the workforce. And it's particularly acute if you don't have elite alumni networks, if you don't have elite career and employer services that are scalable and that can really serve your entire population. And at the same time, you have all this hungry talent, and you have all of these industry experts who may share roots with the students, who may want to give back the way that alumni give back to their alma mater. And so the original thinking of Localized was that if we could channel that expertise, that knowledge, that support, the way that you would channel alumni expertise to students in real time, so that you're not just hearing from, let's say, professors who might have been out of the workforce for 5, 7, 10 years, but actually from the people doing the work at the moment, doing the hiring, to talk about what skills they look for, what their needs are, what opportunities they foresee. That was really the gap that we were looking at, and then figuring out how to channel that at scale. And afterwards, I'm sure we can dig in more on the how.
That's fantastic. Much better than saying my name is so-and-so and I live in such and such and here's my company. So thank you. That was a super great way to start the discussion. So Hamoon, I'll go to you next. And what I know about you so far is something really great, which is that you're a lover of all things blueberry and avocado. That sounds like a really great preview to someone who's going to be a CEO of a tech company. I'm just saying, I think that's great. So you're an immigrant entrepreneur who believes in the necessity of audacious thinking to reimagine our current paradigms. And as we said, you're currently the CEO of FutureFit AI. I'll tell a little bit about FutureFit AI, and then we'd love for you to talk about, what was the screaming need? Why did you think, okay, stop the craziness, we got to have a new company? So FutureFit AI partners with governments and companies to accelerate workforce transformation and development through AI-powered career GPS. And that has been recognized, and you've been recognized by the likes of the World Economic Forum, the UK government, and TD Bank's Future of Work Prize. I love that kind of quick moniker that, the career GPS, I can totally relate. What was the screaming need? Why did you start the company? And welcome.
Thanks so much. Thank you very much, Andrea, and glad to be here with the group. A quick bit of context, as you mentioned, I'm an immigrant kid. And so when I first moved to North America without knowing English, I had to figure out my own path. And so Ronit spoke to this experience of not having networks, not knowing where to go, not knowing what's next. I experienced it very directly as a kid who within 2 weeks of school had 9/11 happen without knowing the language and looking like I did. I then had parents who had to change their names on their resume just so they would get a call back, or they had to remove education and qualifications so that they were more qualified for the entry-level jobs they were trying to get into because their qualifications were unrecognized. And then I spent about a decade in and around the future of workspace. And I think the more time spent in the space, the piece that became more and more clear was no matter which one of the PDF reports you looked at or believed, the common thread was that transitions were only going to magnify and accelerate in scale and magnitude and complexity. So career transitions at any stage of your career increasingly were going to be more frequent, more complex, and harder to navigate because pathways weren't as visible, the rules of the game were constantly changing, the jobs and skills themselves were constantly evolving. And while we talk about this potentially amazing future powered by AI, we forget that there is real impact on real people every day as that AI and automation happens. And so that was very much the premise to say, what does it look like? Rather than talking about protecting jobs, we talk about protecting people because jobs will change and support every single person to make the many transitions they make in their careers more effectively, more successfully with better supports, human and technology enabled supports. And that was very much the premise of the career GPS and the work we're doing at FutureFit AI.
I love this. We have so many threads to follow up on. So thank you. I'm putting a pin in lots of things, GPS pin in that one. So Katie Hall, welcome. And I'll tell you what I know about Katie. We love the fact that we're both familiar with Michigan, Midwest. There we go. We had that in common. Athlete, former Fed who can't stand inequality and inefficiency. So we love someone who's been in the government and can't stand inefficiency. That's what we need more of. 8 years in global workforce development, and that led to Clara, the startup changing the way we find, quantify, and optimize human capital. And what I love about the way you describe Clara is that it is a competency analytics engine that helps companies understand their own people and hire better. And we also love that you say that it's fast, precise, and inclusive with no job descriptions and no resumes. So help us understand what Clara can do for us and what the screaming need was.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for the intro and glad to be here. I know both of the companies that my fellow panelists run, so I'm a big fan, and it's going to take an army of companies like this to change behavior and change the future of work. So love this event. So I spent about 8 years in workforce development at a 501c3 headquartered in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where I went to policy school. And so I worked mostly in the US, but also overseas, helping with all these signaling problems in the labor market that we're talking about, right? So how do companies know how to write job descriptions? How do they know what resumes mean? How do you know what a degree means? What about the half of the world's population that doesn't have a degree and never wrote a resume and isn't online at all? So there are a lot of issues with the language in the way that we connect people to work. And so I remember sitting in a room in the Netherlands, I think in 2016, and one side of the table was talking about competency-based education, and the other side of the table was talking about competency-based hiring. And I thought, why don't we just use technology to build a competency engine and transact only on those statements of what somebody can actually do? So employers tell us over and over again, I just want to know what somebody can actually do on the job. So that's what we built. We built a marketplace where you can learn about your people using competencies and you can hire based only on competencies. we chose to start with middle skilled talent on the marketplace side, which I think is important to point out here. Middle skilled roles and talent still make up the majority of work in the United States and globally. And so what we're saying is our dent is going to be the language, the thing that we use to actually translate human value into economic value through work.
Well, I feel like, honestly, at the end of this 50 minutes, we're going to have solved pretty much end to end, because it seems as if, I keep reading statistics about how many jobs everybody's going to have. So that's a big thing that the three of you probably can dig into. B, the fact that I remember in the old days, we would do this thing called expert systems design. And what you would do is, subject matter expertise, and interview someone like, how does this rocket go to the moon? And you'd interview the engineers and try to extract what they were thinking to teach somebody else. But, you really didn't know what it was. And it wasn't necessarily what they were trained to do that got them to do what they were doing best. And also this notion of networks. I mean, if you don't have the capabilities to connect, if the company doesn't know what to hire for, if the people who are coming out with different skills don't know how to either describe it or connect to somebody that needs that. And then obviously, as Hamoon, you were saying, like, everything's changing. And how do I, as an individual, say, well, I know how to do A and B, but that actually translates to D and E pretty well. I feel like we could start pretty much anywhere. All right, let me stab at something. Let's start with this concept of human. And everybody kind of hinted at this, that, we talk about automation, you've got AI and all these systems, but at the end of the day, it's people. What's your sense? I'll start with Hamoon, and then I'll go to maybe Ronit and then Katie. The sense of how people need to be reconsidered in the new equation having to do with skills and jobs and work. What's different in the people equation for you?
Well, I think probably the headline of that is, we just got to stop treating them like they're widgets, and we're in a game of Harry Potter where we're putting them through sorting hats, right? So much of what happens, whether it's in education, whether it's in basic education, higher education, in the workforce, we make these assumptions about, oh yes, because your current title is an accountant, you're a perfect match to become a cybersecurity analyst. And that is all you are, and that is all you'll become. Or because you don't have a bachelor's degree, therefore the horizons that are available to you are X, Y, or Z. Or when we're in K-12, we say we're going to track you and stream you and predetermine the entirety of your future based on a grade you get on a math test. And I think the most fundamental principle, and we're learning this on the ground when we work with people going through career transitions very clearly, is that the relationship between human and work is incredibly complex. It's about identity, it's about aspiration, it's about ambition, it's about who we are and who we want to become. And that relationship, yes, of course, it can be better supported by technology and by data. And I work at a technology and data company, but we cannot forget that the problem to be solved isn't a linear one. It's not one that we can oversimplify, because if we oversimplify, then we're not actually solving the problem. And perhaps the final thread on this is this element that without understanding truly who someone is and where they're starting from, you can never actually meaningfully support their path. And so this idea of shifting from focusing on here's the training program to take, to understanding who you are and connecting you with the right support.
That's amazing. Ronit, I'm going to ask you to comment on what you just heard, and also build on what you've discovered so far from the human perspective.
Absolutely. I agree with that wholeheartedly. I would say where Localized comes in and where we're focused is the stage before. So I think that the world is changing such that for somebody to succeed, they need the hard skills, the training in whatever discipline they're in. They need the essential skills or soft skills, and they also need the social capital. But within that, part of what we become is a factor of what we're exposed to and what our imaginations allow us to entertain. And if all you're around are, let's say, individuals who are working in certain sectors and not others, you may not know that there's a whole range of opportunity for you where your skills and your passions may actually really flourish. And so for us at Localized, we're a platform that connects university students and recent graduates with industry experts to guide them and employers to hire them, and with a strong focus on emerging markets. And one of the things that we do first is we connect our students and recent grads with what we internally, and I know this is a jargon term, refer to as proximate role models. And the idea of that is that you need to see somebody like you, or that you could believe if that person can do that thing, whatever that is, right? Whatever profession or whatever job, that maybe I can too. You know, it's this idea that there's someone out there doing something that I can credibly imagine myself pursuing as a career path. And that's incredibly important, because if you don't know what your options are, then all the training programs in the world are not going to be applicable to you, and you're not going to be on that path to be able to get there. So I agree wholeheartedly with what Hamoon and what Katie are doing. And you know, I do think that we're working in complementary ways. For us, stage one is exposure. It's what can I be from the best people in the world who share roots with me, who can tell me what it looks like, how I can access it, and then who's hiring that would be willing to look at me. And so those are the pieces that we're focused on.
Well, I'm going to build on and go to Katie, because one of the things that's super interesting to me about the way that you seem to do the analytics, and I want you to tell us more about these competencies, is how you get to that pure point of like being able to know something is, you know, what someone's capable of doing, and how you get to that sort of level of granularity. And also, I thought it was really interesting. You educated me that 50% of the world's population doesn't have a certain piece of paper. And you told me that the first resume was written by Leonardo da Vinci in 1482. It was in like cuneiform on a tablet. Is that what you said?
That's one of my favorite stories. Yeah, I have a lot of lively discussions about resumes and their value. And there are a bunch of different stories about where the first resume came from. But that's a great story for us, because they were, if you sit and think about your experience with a resume, maybe it was you were trying to get a job with one. Maybe it was that you were hiring and having to sift through a pile of resumes. Maybe it's that you never wrote a resume because you don't have a degree and you didn't know what to put on there, right, to even get an interview. And resumes worked in the 1940s because they were meant to capture a bundle of things that would say to an employer, you're probably okay to hire this person because they were in the army and they did these things at home and they can work for you for 30 years, right? And so as we just talked about, people now have 14 jobs. In 2025, they'll have 27 jobs. That doesn't work anymore. So the sort of key for Clara here is this granularity versus bundle discussion that we're talking about, right? So resumes as a bundle of things, competencies as sort of human DNA, right? So what we've been doing is we'll give you this thing and it says, this is a pretty good approximation of what someone can actually do on the job. Competencies are statements of what someone can actually do on the job, right? Maybe you can manage a team of Python engineers. Maybe you can listen with empathy to a teammate who disagrees with you. So we've said, this is the data set and the mechanism that will allow everyone to participate, regardless of whether or not you have a resume or a degree. And the crosswalking that Hamoon and Ronit were just talking about is key. So if you get granular and you use competencies instead of bundles, industries don't really matter, and neither do roles, right? So our very first use case last fall was placing 25 unemployed waiters and waitresses into logistics jobs in 11 days, right? Unemployed, laid off from hospitality, placed in logistics, because those two industries share 70% of the same competencies. So when you get granular, you're faster, and you can also move people around regardless of their background or industry.
I think this is amazing. So I'm going to talk about this shifting, and I'm not trying to go in a circle all the time. And we, you know, I want you to crosstalk as well, but I do want to follow up on this piece of let's go from the competency. So now we know that someone who's currently employed in some job that's called this thing today, but actually has 70% DNA overlap with this other job. And who knew, you know, that was the case. People say, oh, I like to work with people. Well, that could be like, you're the president of the United States, or, you know, you're a hospitality worker, and they're both working with people, I'm sure. You know, I'm thinking about, Hamoon, back to this notion of an individual, right? Because you told a pretty interesting personal story, and I was actually very compelled by that. We have just experienced this pandemic. A lot of people are no longer getting an advantage because I live in San Francisco. You know, we're close to the headquarters of Google. It's like, well, that's great because we're all remote now. So like there's no necessary advantage. the ability for a person to navigate a career, like it used to be, as Ronit was saying, in the old days, it was like, as Katie said, 30 years of like, I'm out of the Army, I'm going to work for General Motors the rest of my life, and that's what I'm going to do. Or, this idea that the job might be somewhat different, you can be fluid, but that the way you're going to get it is, a little bit of network and kind of being able to picture yourself, et cetera. Let's go back to this individual unit, Hamoon, right? Here, anybody is sitting in a world that's just changed completely. So for instance, if everything you were good at, and then you add the layer of in person, has now become everything that you're good at, but maybe not as good at on Zoom or remotely, including managers, including teachers, including everything. What has that done to the world of the individual? You talked about the sort of the crisis that you experienced. And the individual being able to have a GPS for their own career.
I think a lot of that answers we're going to keep discovering for sure as the months and years go by, but maybe a couple of quick data points around this. One, if you take that individual example and look at the overall numbers, right? Over the next 10 to 15 years, 95 million new jobs created, but 80 million of the ones we have today reimagine some level of destruction by automation. And so what you're looking at is that individual becoming 80 million people whose current experience is being directly impacted, and the majority of them needing to make it and yet another transition at least before they make it to retirement. When we work with laid off workers, the words you hear most often are lost, ashamed, and confused, none of which is their fault, right? And so when it comes to that level of now what do I do, whether it's because of the pandemic, because of a layoff, because I've just moved to a new place, or I've come back from a different life stage back into employment, a couple of things come into play. One is this understanding of what are my possible options, and then of those, which one of those are feasible within the time horizon, the budget I've got. All of these factors come into play. But then do I have some data to understand which one of them could be sustainable over time, or I could get to a place where it's going to be sustainable over time? And then to go from A to B, what kind of supports do I need? We talk a lot about learning and training, but I think Ronit also really pointed to this, which is when you actually decode what successful transitions require, yes, there is sometimes some skill development that needs to happen. And we've got, plenty of time to focus on that and attention around it in this space. The pieces that don't get the attention, one is around social capital and networks, which Ronit is doubling down on. And then you've also got what we call this unsexy package of supports, right? I cannot tell you how often things like resume review, LinkedIn profile optimization, the ability to understand how to navigate job search process makes a material difference in chances of having actually a next opportunity show up for you. The final piece I'll say on this is the pandemic impact has been acceleration of automation by almost every single company and enterprise you can think of. Of responsibility that comes with that. Sure, accelerate your business transformation, but will you also take responsibility for the people who will be impacted to make sure they land successfully, whether internally or externally?
So I'm going to do a double down on you, Hamoon, just for a second, a follow-up, and so that to change the rhythm a little bit. So I would love for you to give an example, either fictionalized, real, or a hypothetical of how an individual without FutureFit.ai would function versus with. So today, to me, lost, ashamed, and confused is, once again, this is a very moving group discussion. This is actually not what I was expecting. I was thinking we were going to go into stats on unemployment, et cetera. But this is really profound. People are experiencing profound moments in their life. And what is life without FutureFit.ai versus with, tangibly?
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I will start with a caveat that I'm a big believer of working on a principle of bold humility. So while there's lots we're working to solve for, lots we still need to figure out along the way, along with others like those on the panel. But I think maybe a quick story of this. So coming out of an engineering firm that went through a big project where they were building and then took a downturn, the person's impacted. The first conversation we have with them, no idea how I'm going to tell my family. This is entirely my fault. I don't know if I have any skills anymore. These are the words, these are the experiences that the individual is having. And they said, last time I got laid off, the only way I managed to even find a job was because the same manager I had worked for went to another company 9 months later, gave me a call and said, do you want to come back to this new opportunity? And in those 9 months, this person, she was telling us, I had no idea what to do and how to navigate this process. I kept pressing apply on job boards, and that's all I did, and never heard back. Outreach to them, someone who jumps on a call and says, for a 20-minute chat, how are you feeling? Where are you at? What? And that makes a material difference to know there is support. Even though the majority of their interaction with us from there on becomes through the platform, they know they could send an email if they ever needed to jump on a call with a human again. The second piece is as simple as uploading a resume, putting even a single job title. We're able to do skill inference and say, these are the skills you do have. The market can recognize these skills and employers know what they are. Then within the first week, they've been exposed to career pathways that might be of interest to them, but they get a choice. Do you want to stay where you are, or do you want to explore some of these alternatives? I cannot tell you how often we hear the response of, I had no idea I had these alternatives. And then, conscious of time, I'll just finish with one final example on this. This idea of then being able to see my personalized roadmap of these are the steps I need to take. That support, that guidance makes a big difference when I'm going through that emotional experience.
I really loved how you seem to be addressing, it's kind of ironic to me because it's an AI, technology, and yet everything you've said is about touching human lives and making their paths forward much clearer. And I find that really important and compelling. Katie, I'm going to ask you something about this as well. I'm interested in life with and without Clara, so before it was, but now suddenly, and here's an example of, I would really love to hear something specific so the people listening to the conversation can really have it be relatable.
Yeah, sure. So we're a little bit unique in that sort of the two products we have in market right now are helping businesses understand their people using competencies, and the marketplace is helping workers connect to jobs using competencies. So we have sort of external hiring, internal business intelligence. That's intentional, obviously. That builds the data set of competencies without building on the old data set. But one of the examples that we talk about a lot as a team that I think is a great illustration is, so we had a comment from a worker, I think out in the Northwest, on our Facebook page that resulted from a series of ads that we ran in order to connect workers to the platform. Our ads are resonating with middle-skilled talent in the United States, which, as I mentioned, make up the majority, especially the majority of the unemployed due to the pandemic. And one of the users commented and said, what if I don't have any competencies at all? And our response was, you do have competencies, everyone does. Tell us the types of work that you've done in the past. And so he'd worked in a restaurant and in food service, and he'd also worked in retail. And so we said, that means that you can work with customers, you can stand on your feet for long periods of time. And so we listed a couple off, and he ended up going into Clara and building a profile and getting matched to work for a bunch of jobs that were part of industries he'd never been a part of. And so he'd been unemployed because of the pandemic and was trying a new way to connect to work. And so it was so heartbreaking to hear someone say, what about people who have no competencies at all? And that's the problem we're trying to solve. All humans have competencies that should be digitally visible somewhere in a data set that can be used to connect them to work at any time, in any industry, and in any role. And 71% of the users of our marketplace right now have never been on a job site of any kind. So this is the first time they've been digitally visible somehow to the labor market. And we love that story, and we talk about it as a team all the time. So.
But that's compelling. And it's actually a great segue into what Ronit was talking about earlier, this notion of exposure. If I literally cannot picture myself doing X or being X, or, these ideas planted. I mean, I've been watching way too many old movies. God, women are not viewed well in those films, not a lot of great career role models until like Ally McBeal or whatever came on. I don't know when that was, the 80s. Like you literally can't picture yourself, now we can picture ourselves being vice president, but, like not before. And so what you just said, Katie, is so interesting, because being relatable, having self-awareness that what we've done actually translates to a job. And I can't believe that people haven't been on job sites, and now we have like the capability to let everybody be virtually in any job site, right? So I'm sure that's in your path forward. But Ronit, what you were saying earlier, it reminds me of this too. The ability, earlier you said the ability to see yourself in a role. But you also had a really interesting stat that you shared with us, which is that 85% of the world's population is in emerging markets, and the vast majority are under the age of 27. That was really striking to me. 1 billion will be enrolling in post-secondary educational training by 2050. This notion of massive enrollment. There's a world that is really worth double clicking on in terms of what we picture when we think about, quote, the workforce. I wonder if you would address that, that aspect.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of what Katie just outlined resonates for the demographic that we work with, because the majority have not created LinkedIn profiles. They're not on LinkedIn. They're not discoverable. The way that they tend to be recruited randomly happened to come in and stand at booths. So it was very analog. And the students don't feel comfortable going to a platform like LinkedIn, because we actually had one student who referred to it as Google for people with jobs. It's the place that you go when you have a job. It's not the place that you go before you have a job. And so one of the things that for us is incredibly important, to Hamoon's point, is when the students and recent graduates come on to Localized, we have a career coach in residence who every Sunday is doing CV reviews and interview labs and prep for all of that kind of process, right? Students have on Localized is, does my education measure up? I'm in Lebanon, I'm in Tunisia, I'm in Singapore, I'm in India, I'm in Nigeria. Do I have what it takes? Am I at a world-class level? And so one of the things that happens when you see people operating at a world-class level and you see and you can relate to them is to say, hey, I can do that. There's nothing different between me and this person. And so just a quick anecdote, we just had a student who wrote, or a graduate who wrote to our career coach in residence and said, I had 182 rejections before. I've been coming to your labs. I just got a job where I'm actually in my field. I'm managing people. And not only did I want to let you know, but I also wanted you to let other participants know that they shouldn't get discouraged. And this is in a place where the economic situation is really tough right now. And so that's the kind of, for us, we see it as a journey. It starts with, what are my options? What can I be? And for us, what's really fun is to bring examples of people who defy our expectations. So for example, a woman who has created a smart bra to monitor heart health, who's originally Lebanese and working in IoT, right? And so you wouldn't necessarily be thinking med tech and wearables and data and all of those things, and to bring this person on to talk about her career trajectory. So step one is to just have that exposure. Who's out there at a world-class level? What are they hiring for? How can you get there? The next step is, what are the ways that I need to shape my own presentability or upskill myself in order to be able to get to those kinds of opportunities? And then the third is, what is the mechanism for me to connect with actual employers? So we we held a virtual career fair last summer. It turns out it was the first Middle East and North Africa wide virtual career fair. And when we surveyed the employers, we found that 70% of them had never recruited fresh talent virtually before, but 80% plan to do so moving forward. So and that's not just for Localized, there's a sea change happening right now in the ways that employers are looking for talent. And I think with that comes an awareness by the students that they could compete, and now they're just trying to figure out what those variables are to get in the door.
I love this. And one of the things that's so interesting, and by the way, we've got these great questions coming in from the audience. So I'm going to ask one in just a minute, and keep those cards and letters coming in, folks, from the audience. These are some great questions. So one of the things that you said is super interesting, because at the same time, the world has become very local, and it's also become very not local, very global. Like I like this, I was amazed at how many people from like New Zealand are part of this, and how many, 122 countries. And it's the first year where every single thing I do is completely global, overnight, no worries, be a keynote speaker in one country one day, another country, another, no problem. I think that's super interesting. And also, Ronit, what you said about the not knowing what the level is, right? Like, how do we find a level? And like, is a certain type of education actually better than another? And there are always, regions, just because we work with a lot of incubators that are excelling in some skill. Like right now it's in Nordics and FinTech. And you're going to find world-class talent in lots of fields in different regions for a while that could now spread and populate lots of other places. So I think that's amazing. I'm going to ask the question maybe to Katie. Here's the question from Ed, who will remain last nameless. Do people's competencies have to reflect their past experience? What about radical shifts in interest? There's probably more to that question. So Katie, what's your thought?
Yeah, so the way that competencies are constructed, they should reflect the things that you're good at, which will be a result of jobs that you've done, your personality, experiences that you've had outside of work, all of that. So the competencies in Clara are full sentences, and they contain knowledge, skill, context, and level. So I gave an example earlier. So employers, skills are one word, right? Python, teamwork, communication, collaboration. There are 1,000 competencies under each skill. So employers want more detail. If they get context, they're able to understand the things that you know, because you're actually doing something. In what way are you doing it, and why are you doing it? That's the level of detail they've said they need in order to throw out the old model. So yes, they are a result of things that you've done in the past, things that you've learned, things that you've experienced in your life, not just work, not just one industry. The other important thing to mention, I think, about our platform is the verbs at the front of the statement are what get at experience, right? So are you assisting someone? Are you leading? Are you generating, developing, creating? So it's that verb at the beginning that gets to your experience. But the most important thing to point out here, I think, is it can reflect shifts in interest, because it's your competency profile that you built, and you built it to reflect you. You didn't write it to fit a job. Right? So on Clara, it's blind both directions. So you come in if you're a worker, and you select the things that you can do for whatever reason, it doesn't matter. And that's your profile. If you want to do something different, you don't select specific things, or you skip the jobs that match competencies that you don't necessarily want to execute on the job anymore. So you build your profile, then you match to a job. So we remove that error that's introduced when you adjust your resume to fit a job description. We also reduce the error the other direction by doing the same thing. So employers come in and and they say, we need someone to do these 7 things. Then they see their matches. They don't write a job description to fit candidates they already have in mind. So yes is the short answer to both of your questions, as far as sort of competency science and you controlling your profile.
So I'm going to let Hamoon kind of rant about skills. You told me that skills is like a hot buzzword. Is it the wrong buzzword? Is there, what should we know about skills that you know?
It's interesting with skills, because it very much has taken center stage in this conversation on future of work, right? And I think all I find when we're solving complex problems like this one, is important not to let the buzzwords take over from the necessary nuance to solve the actual problem. So maybe a couple of different cuts on skills. Yes, absolutely, they're important. There are ways of organizing and understanding what's involved in work and in a job. One lens on it is the work Katie is doing, right? There is more complexity than just the skill itself when you think about competencies. And it is important to understand context and domain and dimension. Skills do make it very easy and simple oftentimes for employers to talk about and interact with what people need. And they end up putting a whole bunch of things under that umbrella, even if it's not exactly a skill. Another element on this is the risk that is very real today in terms of how funding by companies and by governments on workforce is being spent is the assumption that by simply putting people into skill training, you're helping them achieve outcomes. And that just doesn't hold, right? Ronit's work would be an example of that. Like there's just many examples. That assumption does not hold. Skills might be a necessary piece of the puzzle, not always and not for everybody. And even when they are a necessary piece, they're almost never alone sufficient to help someone make a successful transition to their next stop, whatever that next stop might be.
So I would love to follow up on that because actually what's really interesting is companies don't know what the jobs require. I'm being really extreme here. So companies don't really have a sense of what the job really requires because they think, I don't know, they used to call it the 9-dot system. You know, someone who's a bank teller becomes a bank teller, but actually there are bank tellers that are very analytical and there's bank tellers that are really good with the public. And so, you know, then you can't define these competencies. Then you have people who don't either have self-awareness or exposure or access or connections or networks or a path or any, you know, job site experience. And then you have skills that you can't even explain, like everybody who says I'm an AI. I mean, there's a million different things about AI. There's mathematicians, there's people who know how to synthesize data, there's everything. And then we have like HR, which no offense to HR, but, you know, a lot of times we're trying to like match talent and, you know, place people. And so it's like everybody ends up just working for, I don't know, McKinsey out of MBA school, you know, like these kind of stereotypes. We can really do better. I mean, it seems like the three companies you have get down to some fundamental importance, you know, of people wanting all over the world, having more equity and opportunity. Just because you went to X school doesn't mean that you're, you know, going to, you know, other than your network, you know, get the leg up. And also it seems like, and Ronit, I think I'll go to you because it seems like there's a big revolution about to happen in this whole world. And by the way, the last topic I'll talk about, because I know that we only have a few more minutes, is the rallying cry and also advice to entrepreneurs, because there's lots of people who are running companies themselves and would love to hear your success stories. Yeah, so Ronit, what do you think is about to really change? You know, because it seems like we're messed up in lots of, or confused or ill-equipped in many, many dimensions.
I think there's a sea change happening everywhere. The exponential change taking place in every sector and how we work, how we learn. You know, our thesis, even before COVID, was that the future of recruiting was more global, more online, more remote. I think that we've seen a decade of this process condensed over the last year and a half, but there's so much that's going on. You know, this idea that 65% of young people will work at jobs that haven't been invented yet, according to the World Economic Forum. I think we're there, right? So the exponential change is happening. So then the question is, how do we make sure that connective tissue is there? And I love the ways that Katie and Hamoon are addressing this. Couple of points on our end. I think one of the things that we're always struck by when we bring in these industry experts to interact with our learners is that the majority of them are actually working in disciplines they didn't start out in. So you know, we had the co-founder and CEO of Careem, a company that was acquired by Uber, who knew nothing about transportation until he was there, right? And he joked that Elon Musk knew nothing about, you know, cars and transportation before he went into it. So I do think it's also important for us to keep in mind that it's not just a function of necessity to transition from one career to the other because of obsolescence, but also because that's the new normal is that all of us are going to have obsolescence obsolete skills. We're going to need to continually transform, upskill, and reinvent ourselves. And so that malaise, that dis-ease, that discomfort is something that we have to learn to live with. The second piece has to do with localization. So global. I think one of the reasons we even launched Localized, and one of my frustrations to this day, is that a lot of initiatives can't just be copied and pasted from one geography to the next. And in the AI space, I see this with assessments, for example, where there are assessments that are being used that have very culturally particular references, that are being pulled from databases of skill sets that are very contextualized. And you can't just move them from one to the other. And so you may have a huge, again, 85% of the world's population may be left out of the design of a lot of these kinds of assessments. And so I would just say, as a note of caution, especially for those who are entering the space, it takes a lot of humility, and it takes a lot of we want to be interacting with different constituencies, different levels of employees, but also the different geographies to factor that in.
So I'm going to go to Katie. I would love to maybe have you build a little bit on that. What is this revolution about from your perspective? I feel like, and we're kind of having to wrap a little bit. We only have about 4 minutes left. So yeah, from your perspective, what's going to shock us, surprise us? What's coming? What's on the horizon in this crazy revolution that we're in?
Yeah, from my perspective, the pandemic became a really unfortunate use case for these three companies, right? I mean, it was the thing that sort of shocked the world as far as labor markets. And wow, there really is no mechanism to move labor market supply in order to keep up with demand when something like this happens, for example. And that's what we had our eye on, of course. But I think, it actually made the case for the three of us in a lot of ways globally for the drum that we've been beating on for a while. I think the thing that's going to shock people is related to one of the questions that I got from investors quite a bit in the early rounds, which is, what about assessment? How do you know that these individuals have the competencies they say they have? How do companies know that, this library is a better data set than the one they already have, which is almost nothing right now, right? And the answer, I think, is speed is worth it. You don't know for sure, but we're going to be 85% right. And if you can hire someone in 1 hour, as opposed to 3 months, it's going to be worth it, right? So I think what's coming is an app where you go online in the morning and you search for things like Python and teamwork and listening with empathy, and you get matched to people worldwide right then, and you hire them an hour later. That speed, I think, is going to catch people off guard, but I think that's where we're heading.
I love that. And, we've only got one more of these. So Hamoon, what's going to shock us, surprise us in this crazy revolution?
I think very soon we are going to have it very much in front of our face that we cannot continue to drive automation and disruption without meaningfully accounting for and investing in the impact, supporting the people who are being impacted as a result of it. Because then if we don't, social revolution versions of it we've already seen is eventually where you end up, because people don't feel like they're taken care of. That's the fundamental piece of it. And I think associated with that is realizing the way we're going about solving this is misguided in a lot of ways and rooted in the wrong principles.
Well, this is going to be hard to do the lightning round. So it's the one word, like one word of advice or like a little phrase. So we have people who are listening or part of this who are employers. We have people who are entrepreneurs. We have people who are, like Hamoon was saying, we need GPSs every day because the world's changing so fast. What would you say is like the one phrase of sort of advice to any of the above? Anyone listening, whether they're an employer, a person who's going to change jobs 22 more times in their lifetime, someone in a country that doesn't feel they have access, someone who doesn't have a network. What's the one piece of kind of advice or short phrase? Ronit, what's your short phrase?
I go back to this idea of experts to guide you, finding employers to hire you. That's ultimately what you're looking for, is that community of experts, and then finding the right, or the right for the moment employer. Love
that. Okay, Katie, what's your short phrase?
I think for entrepreneurs and companies, make the invisible visible, right? Write down everything you can do, write down everything your colleagues can do, write down everything you need the new hire to do, and then watch the diversity come in and watch them fit better.
Okay, Hamoon, you gotta bring it in.
Follow those two, but as someone who works at a company that sells tools, focus on goals, not tools.
I love this. Well, for me, who, I've been working in mobility and, a lot of different projects, but people who are trained in mobility are not prepared to be working in mobility, by the way. A conveyor belt minded person can't do LiDAR. So jobs are changing, people are changing. I am so excited by the work that you are all doing with Localized, with FutureFit.ai, and with Clara. I feel like we should come back in a year and see that you have now become whatever you're supposed to become, unicorns or whatever. This is the way of the future. And I'm just so excited to have been part of this group discussion that was not a panel as part of Global Skills Day 21. So thank you to everybody. It was awesome. And we'll see you in the future. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much. Take care.
It was great. Bye-bye.
Bye.